The first snow of November came early to the Appalachian Mountains that year. Martha Henley stood on the sagging porch of her log cabin, watching white flakes settle on the split rail fence her late husband had built 30 years ago. The wind whistled through gaps in the cabin walls, gaps that seemed to grow wider each winter, as if the mountain itself was trying to reclaim the wood. She was 73 years old, with hands gnarled from decades of work and a back that protested every morning. Her cabin sat 3 miles up a dirt road that became impassable when the real snows came. No children had survived to adulthood. No relatives remained in these mountains. Just Martha and the memories that lived in every corner of these 4 rooms. The hardware store in town wanted $87 for caulking compound. Martha had checked last week, counting her coins twice on the counter, while the young clerk waited with poorly disguised impatience. She had $43 to her name until the next disability check arrived in 2 weeks. The propane tank was already running low. She needed food. The caulking would have to wait just like it had waited last year and the year before. That night, the temperature dropped to 18 degrees. Martha woke at 3 in the morning, her breath visible in the moonlight that streamed through the gaps. She had stuffed old newspapers and rags into the worst cracks, but the wind found its way through anyway, relentless and cruel. She pulled 2 more quilts from the chest, quilts her grandmother had sewn, and lay there thinking about the winter ahead. In the morning, she walked down to the creek that ran behind her property. The banks were slick with frost, and her boots crunched on frozen leaves. She had come here as a girl, playing in the red clay that lined the creek bed. Her mother had made pottery from it, simple bowls and cups that sat on the shelf even now, some of them 50 years old. Martha knelt slowly, her knees popping in protest, and dug her fingers into the clay. It was cold and dense, the color of rust and earth mixed together. She had watched her mother work this clay countless times, had shaped it herself as a child. The memory came back to her hands before it came to her mind. She carried a bucket of clay back to the cabin, her arms shaking with the weight. Inside, she added water slowly, working it with her hands until it became pliable. The texture brought back memories so vivid, she could almost hear her mother's voice. "Press it firm, child. No air bubbles. Make it smooth as butter." Martha approached the largest crack in the north wall, a gap nearly half an inch wide that ran from floor to ceiling. She pressed the clay into it, working it deep into the space between the logs. It fit perfectly, filling the void, becoming part of the wall. She smoothed it with her fingers, the way her mother had taught her, creating a seal that felt solid and right. She worked for 3 hours, filling crack after crack. The clay was free, pulled from the same earth that held up the cabin. Her hands remembered the work, even if her mind had forgotten. When she finished the north wall, the difference was immediate. The whistling wind stopped. The cold draft disappeared. Over the next 2 days, Martha worked her way around the entire cabin. She filled every crack, every gap, every space where winter tried to enter. The clay dried hard as stone, holding firm against the logs. On the 3rd morning, she woke to silence. No wind, no cold air moving through the rooms. Just stillness and warmth from the small propane heater that no longer had to fight against drafts. She made coffee and sat at her kitchen table, looking at the walls. The clay seams were visible, rust-red lines against the weathered gray of the logs, but they were beautiful in their own way. They told a story of survival, of using what the land provided, of refusing to surrender to circumstance. Martha thought about the $87 she hadn't spent, about the clay that had cost her nothing but effort. She thought about her mother, gone 20 years now, who had known these mountains would provide if you knew where to look and weren't afraid to work. The snow continued to fall outside, but inside her cabin, Martha was warm. 3 weeks passed, and the clay held strong through 2 heavy snowstorms. Martha's cabin stayed warmer than it had in years, and her propane lasted longer than she had dared hope. She felt a quiet pride each morning when she touched the clay seams, feeling how solid they had become. Then came the knock on her door that would change everything. Jennifer Caldwell stood on the porch with a clipboard and a county badge clipped to her designer coat. She was maybe 35, with perfect hair and boots that had never seen real mud. She worked for the County Housing Inspection Office, making rounds through the mountain communities to check on elderly residents living alone. Martha invited her in, offering coffee the way mountain hospitality demanded. Jennifer accepted with a smile that didn't quite reach her eyes. She walked through the cabin, taking notes, her expression growing more troubled with each room. "Your foundation is sinking on the east side," Jennifer said, tapping her pen against the clipboard. "The roof needs replacing. These windows are single pane and incredibly inefficient. And these walls." She moved closer to examine the clay-filled cracks. "Mrs. Henley, what is this material you've used?" "Clay from the creek," Martha answered simply. "It works just fine. Keeps the cold out better than it has in years." Jennifer's face shifted from concern to something harder. "Mrs. Henley, this isn't approved building material. Clay isn't rated for structural applications. It's not insulated. Could crack and fall out. More importantly, it's not up to county code for residential dwellings." Martha felt something cold settle in her stomach that had nothing to do with the temperature. "It's been working for 3 weeks solid, through storms and freezing temperatures." "That's not the point," Jennifer continued, her voice taking on the patient tone people use with children or the elderly. "The point is safety and compliance. I'm required to file a report. The cabin needs proper repairs or it will be condemned as uninhabitable." Condemned. The word hung in the air like a threat. "I don't have money for proper repairs," Martha said quietly. "That's why I used the clay." Jennifer softened slightly, but her resolve didn't waver. "There are programs that might help. Senior assistance grants. Low-income housing options in town. But Mrs. Henley, I can't ignore what I've seen here. You'll receive an official notice within 10 days. You'll have 60 days to bring the cabin up to code or vacate the premises." After Jennifer left, Martha sat at her kitchen table for a long time, staring at the clay seams she had worked so hard to create. They looked different now, no longer marks of resourcefulness but evidence of poverty, of failing to meet standards she couldn't afford to reach. The next morning, she walked into town, a 2-hour journey down the mountain road. At the county office, she filled out forms for assistance programs. The clerk, a tired woman named Rosa, looked over her application with sympathy but little hope. "The waiting list for senior housing is 18 months minimum," Rosa explained. "The repair grants have been defunded. You might qualify for emergency relocation assistance, but that means leaving your property." "That cabin is all I have," Martha said, her voice cracking for the first time. "My husband built it. We raised our family there. I can't just leave." Rosa reached across the counter and squeezed her hand. "I understand, sweetheart. I really do. But the county has rules." Martha walked back up the mountain, each step heavier than the last. At home, she looked at every corner of her cabin with new eyes. The sagging porch Jennifer had noted, the sinking foundation, the ancient roof with its missing shingles. She saw her home not as a place of memories and survival, but as a failing structure that the world had judged inadequate. That evening, she received a phone call from her neighbor, Dale Morrison, who lived 2 miles down the road. He had heard about the inspection through the mountain grapevine that spread news faster than any internet. "They can't do this to you, Martha," Dale said, his voice rough with anger. "You've lived there your whole life. They can do whatever the rules let them do," Martha replied, suddenly feeling every one of her 73 years. "Rules don't care about how long you've lived somewhere." She hung up the phone and sat in the growing darkness, not bothering to turn on lights. Outside, the wind had picked up again, but inside, thanks to the clay she now regretted using, the cabin remained warm and silent. The irony wasn't lost on her. She had solved one problem only to create another far worse. The notice arrived exactly 10 days later, just as Jennifer Caldwell had promised. Martha read it 3 times, each word feeling like a nail being driven into the walls of her home. 60 days to comply with 18 separate code violations or face condemnation and forced relocation. She folded the letter and placed it on the kitchen table, then sat staring at the clay seams that had started everything. They had kept her warm, saved her money, solved a problem. Now they were evidence against her. That afternoon, Dale Morrison appeared at her door with 2 other neighbors, Tom Fletcher, a retired coal miner, and Sarah Chan, who ran a small organic farm in the valley. They had brought food, coffee, and determination. "We're not letting them take your home," Dale announced, setting a casserole on the counter. "We've been talking. There has to be a way to fight this." Martha shook her head slowly. "Fight it with what? Lawyers cost money I don't have. The violations are real. The cabin does need repairs." Sarah pulled out her phone, scrolling through something. "I've been researching traditional building methods." "Martha, do you know what your clay actually is? It's not just mud. Based on the creek location and color you described, it's likely high-quality earthen plaster. People pay hundreds of dollars for this stuff at specialty building supply stores." Martha looked up, confused. "What are you talking about?" Sarah's excitement grew as she read from her screen. "Traditional earthen plaster has been used for thousands of years. It's sustainable, non-toxic, breathable, and when properly applied, it's incredibly durable. There's a whole movement of natural builders who use exactly what you used. The problem isn't your clay. The problem is that the county inspector doesn't recognize traditional methods." Tom leaned forward. "My grandfather built his house with clay and straw. Stood for 80 years before the mine company bought the land. There's nothing wrong with the old ways. The new ways just cost more money." Dale pulled out a business card he had been holding. "I called a friend who works in historic preservation. She gave me a name, Professor Michael Stone at Appalachian State University. He studies traditional mountain building techniques. She thinks he might be interested in your situation." Martha took the card, turning it over in her weathered hands. "I don't see how a professor can help me keep my home." "Call him," Sarah urged. "What do you have to lose?" The next morning, Martha dialed the number with shaking fingers. A warm voice answered on the third ring. "Professor Stone speaking." She explained her situation haltingly, expecting dismissal or polite disinterest. Instead, she heard the sound of a chair scraping as he apparently sat up straighter. "Mrs. Henley," he said, his voice filled with an enthusiasm that surprised her. "What you've described is a nearly lost art. Creek clay earthen plaster, applied using traditional hand methods. Would you allow me to visit your property? I'd like to document your technique and test the clay samples." "You want to come here?" Martha asked, bewildered. "If you'll have me, I can be there tomorrow. And Mrs. Henley, if your clay performs as I suspect it will, your cabin might qualify for historic building method protections. Traditional techniques aren't violations. They're cultural preservation." For the first time since Jennifer Caldwell's visit, Martha felt something other than despair. It was small, fragile as new ice on the creek, but it was there. Hope. If you're rooting for Martha to save her home, take a moment and subscribe to the channel. This story is just beginning to turn around, and you won't want to miss what happens next. Professor Stone arrived the following afternoon in a truck loaded with equipment. He was younger than Martha expected, maybe 50, with kind eyes and hands that moved carefully over the clay, seems like a doctor examining a patient. He took samples, measured density, tested adhesion. He photographed every wall from multiple angles. He asked Martha to show him exactly how she had prepared and applied the clay, and he recorded her demonstration on video. "This is remarkable," he kept saying. "Absolutely remarkable. Mrs. Henley, this isn't just functional. This is museum-quality application of a traditional Appalachian building technique. The consistency, the smoothness, the way you've integrated it with the log structure. Where did you learn this?" "My mother," Martha said simply. "She learned from her mother. It's just what we did." Professor Stone looked up from his notes, his expression serious. "What you've done here isn't a code violation. It's a preservation of cultural heritage. And I'm going to make sure the county understands that." Professor Stone worked with an intensity Martha had never witnessed. He spent 3 days at her cabin, documenting everything, taking hundreds of photographs, and conducting tests on the clay samples. Each evening, he sat at her kitchen table, typing furiously on his laptop, building what he called a comprehensive case. On the 4th day, he drove Martha to the county offices. Jennifer Caldwell sat across from them in a small conference room, her supervisor, Richard Marsh, beside her. Jennifer's expression was guarded. Richard looked annoyed at having his afternoon interrupted. Professor Stone opened his laptop and began his presentation. He showed thermal imaging of Martha's walls, demonstrating how the clay provided insulation values comparable to modern caulking. He displayed microscopic analysis proving the clay's composition included natural minerals that actually strengthened as they cured. He presented historical documentation of identical techniques used in Appalachian homesteads dating back 200 years. This isn't substandard construction, Professor Stone stated firmly. This is traditional earthen plaster, a recognized historic building method. Mrs. Henley has applied it with skill that most modern contractors couldn't replicate. Her cabin should be evaluated under historic preservation standards, not contemporary residential codes. Richard Marsh leaned back in his chair, arms crossed. Professor Stone, I appreciate the history lesson, but we have regulations for a reason. Safety standards exist to protect people. Then test the safety, Professor Stone shot back. I've provided structural analysis. The clay has compressive strength exceeding 1200 psi. It's fire-resistant, pest-resistant, and has zero off-gassing of toxic chemicals. What modern material can claim all of that while costing nothing and requiring no industrial production? Jennifer spoke up, her voice uncertain. But it's not listed in any approved building materials database. Professor Stone pulled out another document. Neither is the log construction of the cabin itself by those standards. Mrs. Henley's home predates modern building codes by decades. Under the National Historic Preservation Act and North Carolina state statutes, structures utilizing traditional regional building methods are eligible for code exemptions when those methods can be proven safe and effective. He slid a thick folder across the table. I've prepared an application for historic building status. It includes engineering assessments, material safety data, and endorsements from 3 other universities studying traditional Appalachian construction. I've also contacted the State Historic Preservation Office. They're very interested in Mrs. Henley's cabin as a living example of mountain building heritage. Richard Marsh picked up the folder, flipping through pages with growing interest. Jennifer looked between the professor and her supervisor, clearly uncertain how to proceed. There's one more thing, Professor Stone added. I've been contacted by the Blue Ridge Heritage Foundation. They want to feature Mrs. Henley's cabin in their annual Traditional Skills Workshop. They're prepared to fund a full structural assessment by independent engineers and document her clay application technique for their archive. In exchange, Mrs. Henley would demonstrate her methods to preserve this knowledge for future generations. Martha spoke for the first time, her voice quiet but steady. I just want to keep my home. I'm not trying to break any rules. I'm just trying to survive the winter with what I have. The room fell silent. Jennifer looked down at her hands. Richard Marsh studied Martha for a long moment, then sighed deeply. Give me 2 weeks, he said finally. I'll review this historic status application and consult with the State Preservation Office. Mrs. Henley, your 60-day deadline is suspended pending this review. Professor Stone, I expect a complete engineering safety report on my desk within 10 days. You'll have it in 7, Professor Stone promised. As they walked out of the county building, Martha's legs felt weak. Professor Stone steadied her arm. You did it, Mrs. Henley. You stood up for yourself and your home. I didn't do anything, Martha said. You did all of this. No, he corrected gently. You did something remarkable with 2-cent clay and your own 2 hands. You solved a problem using knowledge passed down through generations. I just helped people see the value in what you already knew. That's not nothing. That's everything. 2 weeks later, Richard Marsh called Martha personally. The engineering report had come back. The clay exceeded safety standards in every category tested. The State Historic Preservation Office had fast-tracked her application. Her cabin was being designated as a protected example of traditional Appalachian earthen plaster construction. The condemnation notice was withdrawn. Not only could Martha stay in her home, but the county would be prohibited from requiring her to remove the clay or alter the historic building methods. Martha hung up the phone and walked outside to the porch. The December air was cold, but inside her cabin, she knew it would be warm. The clay had held, and so had she. The letter arrived on a Tuesday morning in mid-January, official and heavy in Martha's hands. She opened it slowly, still half expecting bad news despite everything that had happened. Instead, she found a certificate declaring her cabin a registered historic structure, along with a personal note from Richard Marsh apologizing for the stress the initial inspection had caused. Professor Stone called that same afternoon. "Mrs. Henley, I have news. The Blue Ridge Heritage Foundation wants to move forward with the workshop. They're offering $5,000 for your participation and the right to document your technique." But there's more. Martha sat down, gripping the phone tighter. "I've been contacted by 3 different organizations. The National Park Service wants to include your story in their Traditional Building Methods archive. A documentary filmmaker from Asheville wants to feature you in a film about Appalachian heritage. And a sustainable building materials company wants to study your clay source. They believe similar creek beds throughout the region could provide affordable, eco-friendly building materials for low-income families." Martha felt dizzy. "I don't understand. All I did was fill some cracks." "You did more than that," Professor Stone said gently. "You proved that old knowledge still has value. That poor doesn't mean wrong. That sustainability isn't a new invention. It's something we forgot." The workshop took place in late February. 23 people gathered at Martha's cabin. People who had driven from as far as Tennessee and Virginia. Architects, builders, students, and homeowners struggling with the same problems Martha had faced. They stood in her small home, touching the clay seams with reverence, asking questions she had never imagined anyone would want answered. She demonstrated her technique on a test wall Professor Stone had constructed. Her hands moved through the familiar motions while cameras recorded every detail. She explained about water ratios, about working the clay until it felt right, about pressing it firm with no air bubbles. The knowledge her mother had given her, passed down through generations, now being preserved for people she would never meet. A young woman named Rebecca approached her during the lunch break. She was maybe 25, with tired eyes and work-worn hands. "I live in a cabin 40 miles from here," she said quietly. "Single mother, 2 kids. I've been stuffing newspaper in the cracks because I can't afford proper materials. Watching you work, knowing I can do this too, it's like someone finally gave me permission to solve my own problems." Martha took Rebecca's hands in her own. "You always had permission, sweetheart. The land provides if you know how to listen." By the end of March, something unexpected had begun. People started visiting Martha, bringing clay from their own creek beds, asking her to test it and teach them. Her cabin became a gathering place for people learning to use what they had instead of buying what they couldn't afford. Dale Morrison built benches on her porch for visitors to sit. Sarah Chun organized a community clay bank, collecting and testing samples from different locations throughout the mountains. The documentary filmmaker, a woman named Lisa Park, spent 2 weeks filming. She captured not just Martha's technique but her story, the inspection that nearly destroyed her, and the community that had rallied around her. When Mountains Remember aired on PBS that fall, Martha's phone rang for days. Letters arrived from across the country, people thanking her for showing that poverty didn't mean powerlessness. Jennifer Caldwell came back too, unannounced, on a cool April morning. She stood on the porch, looking uncomfortable, her county badge absent this time. "Mrs. Henley, I owe you an apology. I came here with my clipboard and my rules, and I almost destroyed something beautiful because I couldn't see past what I'd been trained to see. I'm sorry." Martha invited her in for coffee. They sat at the kitchen table, and Martha noticed Jennifer looking at the clay seams differently now, seeing the craftsmanship instead of the violation. "I've been reviewing our inspection protocols," Jennifer said, "working with Professor Stone to create new guidelines that recognize traditional building methods. No one else should go through what I put you through." "You were doing your job," Martha said. "Sometimes the system is wrong, not the people in it." Jennifer left an hour later, and Martha stood on her porch watching the young woman drive away. The mountains were coming alive with spring, dogwoods blooming white against the green. Her cabin stood solid and warm, its clay seams holding strong through another winter. She thought about how close she had come to losing everything, how fear had almost convinced her to surrender. But the clay had held, her neighbors had stood beside her, and knowledge older than any code book had proven its worth. Martha touched the doorframe, feeling the smooth clay beneath her fingers, and smiled. 2 years had passed since that first winter when Martha filled the cracks in her cabin walls. She stood on her porch now, watching a group of 15 people working with clay at the demonstration area Dale and Tom had built in her side yard. The spring sun was warm on her face, and the mountains stretched green and infinite in every direction. The Appalachian Clay Revival Project, as Professor Stone had named it, had grown beyond anything Martha could have imagined. Her small cabin had become a teaching center, hosting workshops every month from April through October. People came from all over the country to learn the traditional methods, to test clay from their own land, to rediscover what their grandparents had known. Rebecca, the young mother from that first workshop, now worked as Martha's assistant. She had successfully sealed her own cabin using clay from the creek behind her property, and had helped 12 other families do the same. Her children played in Martha's yard while she taught, their laughter mixing with the sounds of people learning to work with earth and water. The Sustainable Building Company had done exactly what Professor Stone predicted. They had mapped clay deposits throughout Appalachians, creating a free resource guide for low-income homeowners. What had started as Martha's desperate solution to a heating problem had become a movement toward accessible, sustainable housing. Families who couldn't afford commercial materials now had options, had knowledge, had hope. Professor Stone visited regularly, always bringing news. A university in Oregon was teaching Martha's technique in their sustainable architecture program. A nonprofit in Kentucky had trained 50 volunteers to help elderly homeowners seal their cabins for winter. The documentary had won an award and was being used in classrooms to teach about traditional knowledge and cultural preservation. But the change Martha treasured most was smaller, more personal. Her cabin, once isolated at the end of an impassable road, had become a place of gathering. Sarah Chun brought fresh vegetables from her garden every week. Dale and Tom had formed a tradition of Sunday morning coffee on her porch, solving the world's problems while birds sang in the trees. Young people came to learn, older people came to remember, and everyone left knowing that their knowledge, their struggles, their solutions mattered. Jennifer Caldwell had become an unexpected friend. She visited monthly now, no longer as an inspector but as someone genuinely interested in preserving mountain heritage. She had championed changes to the county building codes, creating pathways for traditional methods to be recognized alongside modern construction. The fear she had brought that winter day had transformed into partnership. Martha walked through her cabin now, running her hands along walls that had held strong through 2 more winters, through spring rains and summer heat. The clay seams had darkened slightly, weathered but solid, telling the story of survival and adaptation. New cracks had appeared here and there, as old buildings always show, but now Martha knew exactly what to do. More importantly, she knew her solution wasn't wrong or inadequate. It was wisdom. The documentary had brought one more unexpected gift. A letter had arrived last fall from a woman in West Virginia, elderly like Martha, who had written, "I watched your story and cried. For 40 years I've been ashamed of my house, of the way I've had to patch and make do. You showed me there's no shame in using what you have. You gave me back my dignity." Martha had that letter pinned to her kitchen wall. She read it sometimes when she needed reminding that her struggle, her solution, her simple act of filling cracks with creek clay had rippled out in ways she was still discovering. As the afternoon workshop ended and people began packing their cars, several came to say goodbye. A young man from Tennessee shook her hand firmly. "You changed my life, Mrs. Henley. I was about to give up my grandfather's cabin because I couldn't afford to maintain it. Now I know I can." An older woman from Virginia hugged her tight. "My grandmother did this exact same thing. I thought that knowledge had died with her. Thank you for bringing it back." After everyone left, Martha sat on her porch in the growing twilight. The mountains were turning purple in the fading light, ancient and enduring. She thought about the terrified woman she had been 2 years ago, facing condemnation and loss, believing she had failed because she couldn't afford proper materials. That 2-cent piece of clay from the creek had saved more than her cabin. It had saved her sense of worth, had proven that poverty and wisdom could exist in the same hands, had shown that solutions didn't always come from stores but sometimes from the land itself and the knowledge passed down through generations. Martha stood slowly, her joints still protesting but her spirit stronger than it had been in years. She walked inside her warm, solid cabin, touching the clay seams one more time with gratitude. The mountains had provided. Her mother's wisdom had endured, and she had been brave enough to trust both.